She slammed my laptop shut right in the middle of my client presentation, her eyes blazing with the kind of entitlement that only comes from never being told no. "We need this room for the baby's playpen," my sister-in-law announced as if my entire livelihood was nothing more than an inconvenience to her perfect family plans. Behind her, my brother nodded along like the spineless puppet he'd become, while their toddler screamed at decibel levels that could wake the dead. "My name is Victoria Ashworth, and if you think this story ends with me backing down, you haven't been paying attention to how these things really work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Have you ever watched your own family systematically dismantle everything you've built, piece by piece, with smiles on their faces? I stood there in what used to be my sacred workspace, watching Delilah rearrange my carefully organized desk like she was moving furniture in a dollhouse. This wasn't just any room, this was the nerve center of my consulting business, the place where I'd spent 3 years building relationships with Fortune 500 companies, the sanctuary where I'd clawed my way up from bankruptcy to six-figure success. "Victoria, be reasonable," my brother Garrett said, bouncing little Ezra on his hip, while the child grabbed at my business cards and scattered them like confetti. "You can work from the kitchen table. Families adapt, right?" The word reasonable hit me like a slap. Reasonable. As if there was anything reasonable about turning my professional headquarters into a nursery without so much as asking. This had been building for months, ever since Garrett lost his job and moved his family into our childhood home in Willowbrook, the house I'd been paying the mortgage on since our parents died. What started as a temporary arrangement had morphed into a full-scale invasion. First, it was just a few toys in the living room. Then Delilah's yoga mats appeared in the hallway. Soon, their belongings had spread through the house like a virus, claiming territory with each passing day. But my office was supposed to be off-limits. We'd agreed on the converted attic space with its skylights and fiber-optic internet, where I conducted video conferences with executives from Vancouver to Singapore, where every inch was calibrated for maximum productivity and professional presence. Now Delilah was hanging cartoon alphabet letters on my whiteboard, the same whiteboard where I'd mapped out $1 million strategies for tech startups. "I've got the Henderson Industries call in 20 minutes, I said, trying to keep my voice level while my heart hammered against my ribs. "This is literally how I keep this house afloat. How I keep all of us afloat." Delilah paused in her redecorating, a wooden block still in her hand, and gave me that look, the one that said I was being dramatic, unreasonable, selfish. "Oh please, Victoria, you act like what you do is so important. It's just talking on the phone all day. Anyone can do that from anywhere." She gestured dismissively at my carefully curated setup, the professional lighting, the branded backdrop, the ergonomic desk that had taken me months to afford. "Besides, Ezra needs a proper play area. He's growing so fast, anyone can do that from anywhere." The words echoed in my head like a death knell. 3 years of building my reputation, of working 18-hour days to prove myself in a cutthroat industry, of sacrificing social life and sleep, and sometimes meals just to establish credibility in a field dominated by men with corner offices and expense accounts. All of it dismissed with the casual cruelty that only family can deliver. Garrett shifted uncomfortably, sensing the electricity in the air but too weak to pick a side. "Maybe we can work something out," he mumbled, but we all knew he'd already chosen. He'd chosen the path of least resistance, which meant letting his wife steamroll over his sister's livelihood, because confronting Delilah required a spine he'd never possessed. "The baby needs consistency," Delilah continued, now moving my monitors to make room for a plastic kitchen set. "And this room has the best natural light. It's perfect for his development. Perfect for his development. Not perfect for the business that paid for his diapers, his food, the roof over his head. Not perfect for the woman who'd welcomed them with open arms when they had nowhere else to go." I watched her unplug my router, the router that connected me to clients across 3 time zones, to make space for a juice box warmer. Something inside me snapped, but not in the way she expected. Not into tears or screams or desperate pleading. Instead, it snapped into something cold and sharp and absolutely calculating. "You know what?" I said, my voice suddenly calm as glass. You're absolutely right. Anyone can work from anywhere. I began packing my laptop, my cables, my carefully organized files, and anyone can live anywhere too. Delilah looked up from assembling the playpen, confusion flickering across her perfect suburban face. What's that supposed to mean? I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind I'd learned to wear in boardrooms full of men who thought they could intimidate me. It means you just made the biggest mistake of your lives. I hefted my laptop bag over my shoulder and headed for the door. But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough. As I walked down the stairs, Ezra's wails echoing behind me like a soundtrack to chaos, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. The screen showed Harrison Ashworth, Ashworth Logistics, my uncle's trucking company, the family business that had been hemorrhaging money and credibility for the past 2 years. The same business that had refused my offers to help modernize their operations, because, in Uncle Harrison's words, logistics is a man's game, sweetheart. My finger hovered over the call button as I remembered the conversation from last Christmas, when Harrison had complained bitterly about losing contracts to more efficient competitors, about drivers quitting for better opportunities, about the company founded by my grandfather slowly circling the drain. He'd looked right through me when I'd suggested digital optimization strategies, had patted my head like I was still 7 years old playing with toy trucks. Well, Uncle Harrison, I thought as I pressed dial, let's see how much of a man's game it really is when a woman holds all the cards. Because while Delilah was busy turning my office into a playroom, she'd forgotten one crucial detail. The house in Willowbrook wasn't just our childhood home, it was also the collateral I'd used to secure the emergency loan that had kept Ashworth Logistics from bankruptcy last year. The loan that Uncle Harrison had begged me to guarantee when the banks turned him down, the loan that came with very specific terms about ownership transfer in case of default. Terms that were about to become very, very relevant. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When Harrison's gruff voice answered, I could hear the stress and exhaustion that had become his constant companions. Perfect. Uncle Harrison, I said, sweetly, stepping out into the crisp morning air of Willowbrook. We need to talk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You need to understand how we got here, how a family that once stood together became a battlefield where blood meant nothing, and respect was just a word people threw around when they wanted something. The Ashworth family had been built on trucks and grit for 3 generations, but somewhere along the way we'd forgotten that success requires more than just a famous last name. It started 18 months ago when Garrett lost his management position at Brookfield Financial. Not his fault, really. The whole department got axed when they automated half their processes, but instead of dusting himself off and finding something new, he'd spiraled into this victim mentality that made my skin crawl. Delilah, pregnant with Ezra at the time, had insisted they couldn't afford their apartment in Riverside Heights anymore. Family helps family, she'd said, with those crocodile tears that Garrett fell for every single time. So I'd opened my doors, opened my home, opened my wallet when their savings ran dry after 2 months. I was the successful one, after all. The one who'd taken her business degree and turned it into a thriving consultancy that specialized in operational efficiency for mid-size companies. While Garrett was floating through life waiting for opportunities to fall into his lap, I was working 16-hour days to build something that mattered. The house in Willowbrook had been our parents' pride and joy before the car accident 3 years ago. Mom had loved the wraparound porch and the old oak trees, while Dad had spent weekends tinkering in the garage that I'd eventually converted into additional storage for my business files. When they died, Garrett expected we'd sell it and split the money 50-50 like some kind of participation trophy for existing, but I'd had different plans. I'd bought out his half, used every penny of my savings, and took on a mortgage that made my accountant wince. This house wasn't just real estate to me, it was going to be my headquarters, my sanctuary, the place where I'd prove that Victoria Ashworth was more than just another consultant in a crowded field. The attic conversion alone had cost me $12,000. I'd hired contractors to install those skylights, to run dedicated internet lines, to create the kind of professional space that would impress clients from Fortune 500 companies. Every cable was hidden, every angle calculated for optimal video conferencing. I'd even had acoustic panels installed so that street noise wouldn't interfere with my calls to Tokyo or London. For 2 years it had been perfect. My business had grown from desperate startup to industry player, and that office had been the engine of everything. Clients would comment on my setup during video calls, impressed by the professionalism and attention to detail. Some had even asked for referrals to my interior designer, not knowing that every choice had been made by a woman who understood that in the business world, perception was everything. Then Garrett and Delilah had arrived with their U-Haul and their assumptions about temporary arrangement. What I'd meant as a 6-month helping hand while Garrett found new work had somehow become permanent residents without discussion or gratitude. They'd settled in like they owned the place, making themselves comfortable while I continued to carry the financial load. The worst part wasn't the extra utility bills or the grocery costs that had tripled overnight. It wasn't even Ezra's midnight crying sessions that woke me up before important presentations. It was the complete lack of respect for what I'd built. Delilah would interrupt my calls to ask where I kept the vacuum cleaner. Garrett would bring his buddies over for beer and football, turning my quiet professional environment into a fraternity house. I'd tried to set boundaries, gentle ones at first, then firmer ones as the months wore on. Please keep Ezra out of my office during business hours. Could you use headphones when watching TV? I need the living room clear for client calls on Tuesday afternoons. Each request had been met with eye rolls and comments about how I was being uptight or too controlling. But today had been the final straw. Today, Delilah hadn't just crossed a boundary, she'd obliterated it with the casual cruelty that only family members can manage. The woman who hadn't worked a day since college, who spent her mornings posting Instagram stories about mom life while I paid for her organic groceries and her yoga memberships, had decided that my livelihood was less important than her toddler's play space. And Garrett, sweet, spineless Garrett, had stood there and watched it happen. The brother who used to build blanket forts with me when we were kids, who'd promised at mom and dad's funeral that we'd always look out for each other, had chosen his wife's convenience over his sister's career without a moment's hesitation. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about during their 18 months of freeloading, was how deeply connected our family was to Ashworth Logistics. Uncle Harrison wasn't just Dad's older brother, he was the keeper of the family legacy, the man who'd inherited Grandpa's trucking empire and had spent the last decade running it into the ground with his stubborn refusal to modernize. 2 years ago, when Harrison had come to me with his hat in his hand and desperation in his eyes, I'd seen an opportunity. The company was hemorrhaging money, losing contracts to competitors who understood that logistics in the 21st century required more than good old boy handshake deals and paper manifests. Harrison needed capital injection and operational overhaul, but the banks had already written him off as a bad risk. So I'd done what family does. I'd guaranteed a loan using the Willowbrook house as collateral, but I'd also negotiated terms that Harrison had been too desperate to read carefully. Terms that included performance benchmarks, modernization requirements, and a very specific clause about ownership transfer if certain conditions weren't met. Harrison had agreed to everything, grateful for the lifeline, and confident that his years of experience would turn things around. He'd also made it crystal clear that while he appreciated my financial help, he didn't need my operational advice. Trucking is a man's business, sweetheart, he'd said, with that patronizing smile. You stick to your computer work, and let us handle the real world. For 18 months, I'd watched Ashworth Logistics continue its slow-motion collapse, while Harrison blamed everything except his own outdated methods. Lost contracts, driver turnover, safety violations, customer complaints. The warning signs had been flashing red for months, but Harrison's pride had blinded him to reality. Meanwhile, I'd been building relationships in the logistics consulting space, learning the industry from the inside out, developing strategies that could revolutionize a traditional trucking company, all while Harrison continued to treat me like the little girl who used to play with toy trucks in Grandpa's office. But as I sat in my car outside the Willowbrook house, listening to Uncle Harrison's stressed voice on the phone, I realized that Delilah and Garrett had just given me the perfect excuse to stop being patient. They'd shown me exactly how much respect the Ashworth family had for Victoria's contributions. Time to show them what Victoria Ashworth was really capable of when she stopped playing nice. I've got drivers to manage and routes to plan. Whatever business advice you're peddling can wait. The dismissal hit harder today, probably because I was already raw from having my entire professional life dismantled by a woman who thought my career was just talking on the phone all day. I sat in my car outside the house that I owned, that I paid for, that I'd sacrificed everything to maintain, and felt something crack deep inside my chest. Not break, crack. Like a windshield after a rock hits it, spider webbing outward, but still holding together through sheer stubbornness. The sound of Ezra's crying drifted through the windows, mixing with Delilah's voice as she directed Garrett to move more of my equipment out of her new playroom. This was rock bottom, wasn't it? Sitting in a parking spot on my own property because my family had literally taken over my workspace, while the uncle who owed me everything hung up on me like I was some persistent telemarketer. I'd spent 3 years building something meaningful, something important, only to watch it get reduced to toys and tantrums and the casual cruelty of people who took my generosity for granted. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, Henderson Industries quarterly review. In 30 minutes, I was supposed to present operational efficiency recommendations to a company that paid me more in 1/4 than most people made in a year. Instead, I was homeless in my own driveway, trying to figure out where I could possibly conduct a professional video conference without a toddler screaming in the background. I drove to the Willowbrook Public Library, the same building where I'd done homework as a kid, where Mom used to take Garrett and me for story time when we were too young to understand how complicated families could become. The irony wasn't lost on me, reduced to using public Wi-Fi for a call that could determine whether Henderson Industries renewed their annual contract. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, recognized me from high school and offered a small conference room in the back. I set up my laptop, between motivational posters about reading and personal growth, trying to create some semblance of professionalism in a space designed for community book clubs. The Wi-Fi was decent enough, but the whole situation felt like a cosmic joke. Victoria Ashworth, the woman who'd been featured in Business Weekly for her innovative approaches to supply chain optimization, conducting million-dollar negotiations from a library conference room, because her family had evicted her from her own office. The Henderson call went better than expected, considering I was operating out of exile. I'd prepared well, my recommendations were solid, and the client seemed satisfied with the quarterly results. But as I packed up my equipment afterward, the humiliation settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't sustainable. I couldn't run a consulting business from library conference rooms and coffee shop tables. My reputation depended on consistency, professionalism, the kind of environment that inspired confidence in corporate executives who had plenty of other consultants to choose from. Walking back to my car, I passed the town's main strip where Ashworth Logistics had their headquarters, a modest building that had seen better days, with paint peeling around the windows and a parking lot full of aging trucks that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a modern freight operation. A now hiring sign hung crooked in the window, the same sign that had been there for months as drivers continued to leave for companies that offered better benefits and more reliable equipment. This was the family legacy that Harrison was so determined to protect from female interference. A dying business that hemorrhaged money and respect in equal measure, while the man who'd inherited it based solely on his gender refused help from the one person in the family who actually understood how to fix it. I sat in my car across from the building, studying the operation that had once been Grandpa's pride and joy. Even from the street, I could see the problems. Trucks parked haphazardly instead of in organized rows, drivers lounging around instead of following efficient schedules, paperwork scattered across dashboards instead of managed through digital systems. It was chaos masquerading as tradition, inefficiency wrapped in the flag of the way we've always done things. But underneath my frustration, something else was stirring, a cold, calculating anger that felt different from the hot rage I'd experienced in my commandeered office. This was sharper, more focused, the kind of anger that comes from finally seeing a situation clearly instead of through the fog of family loyalty and misplaced hope. They'd all underestimated me. Delilah, who thought my work was trivial enough to displace for a playroom. Garrett, who'd stood by and watched his wife demolish his sister's livelihood without a word of protest. Harrison, who'd taken my money and my help while dismissing my expertise as irrelevant to real business. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent the last 18 months learning everything there was to know about the logistics industry. Not because I'd planned some elaborate takeover, but because when you guarantee a loan with your house as collateral, you damn well better understand the business you're backing. I'd studied transportation regulations, driver retention strategies, fleet management systems, customer acquisition methods, everything Harrison was too proud to modernize. I'd also been tracking Ashworth Logistics' performance metrics more closely than Harrison realized. The loan terms I'd negotiated included regular financial reporting requirements, which meant I had access to information that painted a picture far worse than what Harrison admitted publicly. The company wasn't just struggling, it was in free fall, losing major contracts every quarter while operating costs continued to climb. The performance benchmarks we'd agreed upon weren't just suggestions, they were legal requirements tied to the loan agreement. Benchmarks that Harrison had missed for 6 consecutive quarters now, triggering clauses that he'd been too desperate to read carefully when he'd signed them, clauses that were about to become very relevant. My phone rang, interrupting my surveillance of the family business. It was Delilah, probably calling to apologize or explain, or maybe even to negotiate some kind of shared custody arrangement for my own office. I almost declined the call, but curiosity won out. "Victoria, where are you?" Her voice had that fake, concerned tone that meant she wanted something. "Garrett's worried about you. You left so suddenly." "Did I?" I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I thought I was just adapting to the new living arrangements you've established. Look, maybe we can work something out. You could use the office in the mornings, and Ezra could have it in the afternoons. We could share my office, the space I'd designed, funded and built specifically for my business needs." She wanted me to timeshare my own workspace with a toddler. "That's very generous of you, Delilah," I said, letting just enough ice creep into my voice to make her uncomfortable. "But I don't think that's going to work out." "What do you mean?" I looked across the street at the Ashworth Logistics building, at the empire that my grandfather had built and my uncle was destroying through sheer incompetence and stubborn pride, at the business that owed its continued existence to my financial backing and my house as collateral. "I mean that things are about to change around here," I said softly, "for all of us." "Victoria, you're scaring me a little." "What are you talking about?" I smiled, though she couldn't see it through the phone. "Don't worry, Delilah, you'll understand soon enough. In the meantime, enjoy the playroom. I hope Ezra gets good use out of it." I hung up before she could respond and pulled out the loan documentation I kept in my car's glove compartment. 18 months of financial reports, missed benchmarks and unmet modernization requirements. 18 months of Harrison's promises that he'd turn things around while the business continued its slow-motion collapse. But most importantly, 18 months of a performance clock that had been ticking steadily toward a very specific deadline. A deadline that was now less than 30 days away. I started the car and pulled away from the Ashworth Logistics building. But not before taking one last look at what would soon become mine. Not through manipulation, or family politics, or gender-based inheritance traditions. Through pure documented, legally ironclad business failure. That night, I spread 18 months of documentation across my kitchen table like a general planning. A siege. Financial reports, loan agreements, performance metrics, industry analyses, everything I'd been quietly collecting while playing the role of supportive family member. What Uncle Harrison didn't realize was that when you guarantee $1 million loan with your house as collateral, you don't just hope for the best. You prepare for the worst. The loan agreement was a masterpiece of legal precision, crafted by the best commercial attorney I could afford. Harrison had been so desperate for the capital injection that he'd signed without reading the fine print, trusting family to keep things simple. But I'd learned long ago that family could be the most ruthless adversaries of all, especially when money and pride were involved. Section 12.3 was particularly beautiful in its clarity. Failure to meet established performance benchmarks for 6 consecutive quarters or failure to implement agreed-upon modernization protocols within 18 months of loan origination shall constitute grounds for immediate transfer of operational control to the guarantor. Harrison had missed those benchmarks by wider margins each quarter, and the 18-month deadline was exactly 27 days away. But the documentation was just the foundation. The real weapon I'd been building was knowledge, deep, comprehensive understanding of every aspect of the logistics industry that Harrison dismissed as too complicated for outsiders. While he'd been stubbornly clinging to methods that worked in 1995, I'd been studying companies that were revolutionizing freight transportation in the digital age. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder labeled AL Restructuring Plan, a document I'd been refining for months, initially as a helpful suggestion for Harrison, now as a blueprint for complete transformation. It contained everything: driver retention programs, based on industry best practices, fleet modernization schedules, technology integration timelines, customer acquisition strategies, cost reduction protocol. Every page represented hours of research, industry interviews, and analysis that would have impressed any MBA program. The irony was that I'd tried to share pieces of this plan with Harrison during family dinners, casual conversations, even formal presentations that he'd brushed off with patronizing smiles. "That's cute, Victoria, but trucking isn't about fancy computers and charts. It's about relationships and knowing the road." Meanwhile, his relationships had been canceling contracts and his road knowledge had resulted in safety violations that were killing the company's insurance rate. My phone buzzed with a text from my business partner, Rachel Montenegro, who ran a logistics consulting firm in Seattle. We'd been collaborating on several projects, and she'd been trying to convince me to join her company as East Coast Operations Director. "Victoria, that offer is still open. You'd have complete autonomy over regional expansion, plus equity stake. Think about it." 6 months ago, I'd declined Rachel's offer because I was committed to staying in Willowbrook, to supporting my family, to making things work in the town where I'd grown up. Now, looking at the evidence of their complete disrespect spread across my kitchen table, that loyalty felt like stupidity. But Rachel's offer had given me another idea, one that would solve multiple problems simultaneously. I opened a new document and began typing, "Strategic Partnership Proposal, Ashworth Logistics and Montenegro Transportation Solutions." If I was going to take over Harrison's company, I wouldn't do it alone. I'd bring in the best logistics minds on the East Coast, transforming a failing local trucking company into a regional powerhouse that could compete with anyone. The restructuring plan was extensive, but the legal pathway was surprisingly simple. Harrison's performance failures had triggered multiple clauses in our agreement, any one of which would justify immediate intervention. The safety violations alone, 3 DOT citations in the past 4 months, constituted breach of the operational standards he'd agreed to maintain. The financial metrics were even worse: revenue down 37% year-over-year, with profit margins that had turned negative in the last 2 quarters. But I hadn't been passive during these 18 months of watching Harrison destroy Grandpa's legacy. I'd been building relationships throughout the industry, establishing credibility, positioning myself as someone who understood both the traditional values of family business and the modern realities of competitive logistics. The consulting work had been perfect cover. It gave me legitimate reasons to attend industry conferences, to network with fleet managers and transportation executives, to understand the market from every angle. 3 months ago, I'd even completed a certification program in transportation management, earning credentials that Harrison didn't possess despite running a trucking company for 12 years. The certificate was framed in my home office, or former home office, now that it had been converted into Ezra's playroom, another insult to add to the growing list. My laptop chimed with an email from Henderson Industries, confirming renewal of our consulting contract for another year. The irony was perfect. While my family was dismantling my workspace and dismissing my career as unimportant, my actual clients were expanding our relationship and increasing my retainer fee. I was succeeding in spite of their sabotage, but I was tired of succeeding in spite of anything. I pulled up Harrison's employee records, another treasure trove of information that came with the loan agreement's transparency requirements. Ashworth Logistics was hemorrhaging drivers at a rate that would make any competent manager panic. Turnover was at 73% annually, compared to an industry average of 36%. Exit interviews, when they bothered to conduct them, revealed the same complaints repeatedly: outdated equipment, poor communication, lack of benefits, management that treated drivers like replaceable parts rather than valuable assets. The customer data was equally damning. Ashworth Logistics had lost 4 major contracts in the past year, including the Brookfield manufacturing account that had been with the company for 15 years. The reasons cited were always the same: missed deliveries, poor customer service, inability to provide real-time tracking and communication. Basic requirements in modern logistics that Harrison refused to implement because he'd rather trust his gut than invest in GPS systems and customer portal. But the most telling document was Harrison's own strategic plan, submitted to the bank as part of his loan application. It was a single page of vague promises and empty buzzwords, the kind of document that screamed incompetence to anyone with actual business experience. No specific metrics, no timeline, no understanding of competitive pressures or market trends, just a rambling paragraph about getting back to basics and focusing on what we do best. I'd kept copies of everything, building a case file that would justify any action I chose to take. Not because I'd planned some elaborate revenge scheme, but because when you're responsible for $1 million loan, due diligence isn't optional. Harrison's failures weren't just disappointing, they were threatening my financial security and my professional reputation. The transformation plan I'd developed wasn't just about fixing Ashworth Logistics, it was about creating something entirely new, a company that honored Grandpa's legacy, while embracing everything that Harrison had stubbornly rejected: modern fleet management, driver-focused culture, technology integration, customer service excellence, all the innovations that were separating successful logistics companies from the dinosaurs that refused to evolve. I'd even identified the specific vendors and systems we'd need: a fleet management platform that would optimize routes and reduce fuel costs, a driver communication app that would improve retention and job satisfaction, a customer portal that would provide real-time tracking and delivery updates. The implementation timeline was aggressive but achievable, assuming you had someone in charge who understood that change was survival, not betrayal of tradition. The financing was already in place through Rachel's network of investors, pending a successful acquisition target. The management team could be assembled within 60 days, drawing from the pool of logistics professionals who'd been watching Ashworth Logistics decline with the kind of frustrated expertise that comes from knowing exactly how to fix problems that leadership refuses to acknowledge. By 2 in the morning, I had everything mapped out: the legal justification, the business plan, the operational strategy, the financial projection. What had started as a defensive response to family disrespect had evolved into something far more powerful: a complete vision for taking control of my own destiny while saving a company that my grandfather had built with his own hands. Harrison thought trucking was a man's business that couldn't be understood by someone who worked with computers and charts. Tomorrow I'd show him exactly what computers and charts could accomplish when they were wielded by someone who refused to accept failure as inevitable. The clock on my kitchen wall showed 2:17 a.m. As I closed my laptop and gathered the documents back into their folders. In less than 7 hours, I'd make the phone call that would change everything. Not because I wanted revenge, but because sometimes the only way to honor your family's legacy is to save it from the people who are destroying it. I waited until exactly 9:00 a.m. to make the call, knowing that Harrison would be in his office nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and complaining about driver schedules to anyone within earshot. Tuesday mornings were his weekly ritual of reviewing the previous week's disasters, while blaming everyone except the man making the decisions. Perfect timing for what I had planned. Ashworth Logistics, this is Harrison. His voice carried that familiar mixture of exhaustion and irritation that had become his default tone over the past year. Uncle Harrison, it's Victoria. We need to schedule a formal meeting regarding the loan performance review. Today would be preferable. There was a pause, the kind of silence that meant he was trying to figure out why his niece suddenly sounded like a lawyer instead of the accommodating family member he'd grown accustomed to dismissing. Performance review, Victoria honey. We've talked about this. The business is fine. You worry too much about numbers that don't tell the whole story. Actually, The numbers tell exactly the story we need to discuss. I'll be there at 2:00 p.m. with my legal counsel and financial advisor. Please have your business records available for inspection. Legal counsel? What the hell are you talking about, Victoria? We're family. Yes, we are. And as family, I'm giving you the courtesy of a face-to-face meeting before I invoke the performance clauses in our loan agreement. Section 12.3 is quite clear about the consequences of missing benchmarks for 6 consecutive quarters. The silence stretched longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in Harrison's head as he tried to remember what exactly he'd signed 18 months ago when desperation had made him careless with details. Now hold on just a minute. 2:00 p.m., Uncle Harrison. I'll see you then. I hung up before he could argue, then immediately called Rachel Montenegro in Seattle. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with the kind of energy that came from building a successful company through pure competence and determination. Victoria, please tell me you're calling about the partnership we discussed. I've got 3 major contracts lined up that would be perfect for East Coast expansion. Better than that, Rachel. I'm calling about an acquisition opportunity. Ashworth Logistics is about to become available, and I want Montenegro Transportation Solutions positioned as the strategic partner for a complete operational transformation. Rachel's laugh was pure satisfaction. You magnificent woman, how long do we have to put together a proposal? The legal transition should be complete within 48 hours. I need you and your team here by Thursday morning with a comprehensive integration plan and your best management person. We're not just taking over a failing trucking company, we're demonstrating what happens when qualified people finally get the chance to implement actual business strategy. Consider it done. My operations manager can be on a plane tonight, and I'll follow with the full team tomorrow. Victoria, this is going to be beautiful. After hanging up with Rachel, I called my attorney, Marcus Whitfield, who drafted the original loan agreement with the kind of meticulous precision that made hostile takeovers look like friendly family transition. Marcus had warned me 18 months ago that the performance clauses were aggressive, but I'd insisted on terms that would protect my investment from incompetent management. Now those terms were about to prove their worth. Victoria, I've been expecting this call for months, Marcus said with the satisfaction of a lawyer whose careful work was about to pay dividends. Harrison's missed every benchmark by significant margins. The safety violations alone would justify immediate intervention under Section 5. How quickly can we execute the transition? 24 hours once you formally declare default. I've had the paperwork ready since his 3rd consecutive quarterly failure. The beauty of this situation is that everything is documented, witnessed, and legally unassailable. Harrison signed away operational control the moment he failed to meet his obligations. Perfect. I'll need you at the 2:00 p.m. meeting to walk him through the process. Make it clear that this isn't negotiable. It's the natural consequence of 18 months of documented business failure. My next call was to the Brookfield Savings and Trust, where I'd built a relationship with senior loan officer Patricia Hendricks during the original financing process. Patricia had been skeptical of Harrison's ability to turn the company around, but she'd approved the loan based on my guarantee and my own financial track record. Ms. Ashworth, I was wondering when you'd call. We've been monitoring Ashworth Logistics' performance through the required quarterly reports, and frankly, we're concerned about your exposure. Harrison's default on the modernization requirements triggered our risk management protocols 3 months ago. That's exactly why I'm calling Patricia. I'm exercising the performance clauses tomorrow and assuming operational control. I wanted to give you advance notice that the transition will be smooth and that new management will be implementing immediate improvements. Honestly, Victoria, we've been watching this train wreck in slow motion. Harrison's a nice man, but he's been running that company like it's still 1995. What's your timeline for operational improvement? Full digital integration within 60 days. Fleet modernization starting immediately. New customer acquisition protocols in place by next month. I'm bringing in Montenegro Transportation Solutions as strategic partners. They're the fastest growing logistics company on the West Coast. Impressive. This sounds like exactly the kind of professional management that company needs. You'll have our full support during the transition. The dominoes were falling into place with the satisfying precision of a plan executed by someone who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. While Harrison had been stumbling through another day of crisis management and finger-pointing, I'd been building the infrastructure for a complete business transformation. But the most important call was still ahead of me. I dialed the number for David Chen, Harrison's longest-serving driver and informal leader among the remaining employees. David had been with Ashworth Logistics for 8 years, watching the company's decline with the frustrated expertise of someone who understood exactly what needed to change, but had no power to implement improvements. "David, it's Victoria Ashworth. Do you have a few minutes to talk private?" "Ms. Ashworth, of course. Is everything okay? Your uncle seemed pretty stressed this morning after talking to someone on the phone." "Everything's about to be much better, David. I'm calling because tomorrow there will be significant changes in company management, and I wanted to speak with you directly about what that means for the drivers." "Changes? What kind of changes?" "The kind that include modern equipment, competitive benefits, GPS navigation systems and management that actually listens when drivers report problems. I'll be assuming operational control of the company starting tomorrow, and my first priority is retaining the experienced drivers who've been keeping this operation running despite management failures." The silence on David's line was different from Harrison's earlier confusion. This was the silence of a man processing hope after months of resignation. "Ms. Ashworth, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that Ashworth Logistics is about to become the kind of company that treats drivers like professional assets, instead of replaceable parts. New trucks, better routes, real communication, and the kind of benefits package that makes people want to stay instead of looking for the next opportunity." "Holy shit. Sorry ma'am, we've been waiting for something like this for years. The guys are going to lose their minds when they hear this. Then I'll see you at tomorrow's all-hands meeting at 10 a.m. Bring everyone who's interested in being part of a real logistics company instead of whatever this has been." By 1:30 p.m. I was sitting in my car outside the Ashworth Logistics building, watching Harrison pace back and forth in his office window like a caged animal who'd finally realized his cage had been locked from the outside all along. Marcus Whitfield sat beside me, reviewing the final documentation one more time with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. "Are you ready for this, Victoria? Once we walk through those doors, there's no going back. You'll own this company and all its problems." I looked at the building that housed my grandfather's legacy, thinking about the man who'd built something meaningful from nothing, who'd created jobs and supported families through honest work and fair dealing. Then I thought about the past 18 months of watching that legacy crumble under Harrison's stubborn incompetence, while he dismissed every offer of help as feminine interference. "I've been ready for this since the day Harrison told me that trucking was too complicated for someone who worked with computers and charts," I said, gathering my documents and stepping out of the car. Time to show him exactly what computers and charts can accomplish when they're used by someone who actually understands business. Marcus followed me toward the building entrance, both of us moving with the confident stride of people who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. Inside that building, Harrison was about to learn that family loyalty only extends as far as family competence, and that sometimes the best way to honor your grandfather's memory is to save his company from the grandson who's destroying it. The confrontation was 30 minutes away, but the real transformation had been building for 18 months. Now it was time to stop watching from the sidelines and start playing the game to win. Harrison was waiting in the lobby when Marcus and I walked through the glass doors of Ashworth Logistics at exactly 2. He'd clearly spent the last few hours working himself into a defensive frenzy, his face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from being cornered by circumstances you refuse to acknowledge. Behind him stood his secretary, Patterson, who'd been with the company since Grandpa's time and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Victoria, what's this nonsense about legal counsel and performance review?" Harrison's voice carried across the lobby with the forced volume of a man trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "We're family. We don't need lawyers to settle family business." I set my briefcase down on the reception counter with deliberate precision, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet space. "Actually, Uncle Harrison, this stopped being family business the moment you signed a commercial loan agreement with performance benchmarks and operational requirements." "Marcus, Would you please explain the legal framework we're operating under? Marcus Whitfield stepped forward with the calm confidence of a lawyer who'd spent 18 months preparing for this exact moment. He was everything Harrison wasn't: prepared, professional, and armed with documentation that couldn't be dismissed with folksy wisdom or patriarchal condescension. Mr. Ashworth, I'm Marcus Whitfield, legal counsel for Ms. Ashworth and the primary guarantor of your business loan. We're here to discuss your company's failure to meet the performance benchmarks outlined in Section 8, the 1 through 807 of your loan agreement, as well as your non-compliance with the modernization requirements specified in Section. Harrison's face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, recognition, denial, and finally a dawning horror as he began to understand that this wasn't some family intervention he could laugh off. Now wait just a goddamn minute. That loan was a formality. Victoria was helping family, not setting up some corporate takeover. I'm afraid the documentation tells a different story, Marcus continued, opening his briefcase and extracting a thick folder that landed on the counter with the weight of legal inevitability. Your company has missed every performance benchmark for 6 consecutive quarters. Revenue decline, 37% year-over-year. Profit margins, negative for 8 consecutive months. Customer retention down 42%. Safety violations, 3 DOT citations in 4 months. Driver turnover, 73% annually. Each statistic hit Harrison like a physical blow. I watched his face crumble as the numbers painted a picture of failure so comprehensive that even his legendary stubbornness couldn't deny the evidence. Miss Patterson looked like she wanted to disappear into the filing cabinets. Those numbers don't tell the whole story, Harrison stammered, but his voice had lost its earlier bravado. Business is cyclical. We've had tough years before. Have you ever had years where you lost the Brookfield manufacturing contract? I asked quietly, stepping closer to the man who'd spent 18 months dismissing my expertise as irrelevant to real business. What about the Henderson Industries account? Morrison Freight. All contracts that cited the same reasons for termination: missed deliveries, poor communication, inability to provide basic tracking services. Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. These weren't abstract performance metrics anymore. These were the specific failures that had been eating away at his company's foundation, while he'd been too proud to acknowledge the problems or accept solutions. Furthermore, Marcus continued with surgical precision, the modernization requirements outlined in Section 2 have not been implemented despite the 18-month deadline approaching in 27 days. No GPS tracking systems, no digital dispatch protocols, no customer communication portals, no driver retention programs. The agreement specifically states that failure to implement these improvements constitutes grounds for immediate transfer of operational control. Transfer of operational control. Harrison's voice cracked on the words. What the hell does that mean? I stepped forward, no longer the accommodating niece, seeking family approval, but a business professional exercising legal rights that had been carefully negotiated and thoroughly documented. It means, Uncle Harrison, that as of tomorrow morning, I will be assuming full operational control of Ashworth Logistics under the authority granted by your loan default. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison stared at me like I'd just announced that gravity had been reversed, his brain struggling to process how his little niece had somehow maneuvered him into a position where she held all the power. Mrs. Patterson's gasp was audible from across the lobby. You can't, this is my company. Dad left it to me. You can't just take over because of some paperwork technicality. This isn't a technicality, Harrison. This is the natural consequence of 18 months of documented business failure combined with your refusal to accept help, implement improvements, or acknowledge reality. My voice remained steady, professional, but underneath I felt the satisfying burn of vindication. Grandpa built this company to last, to support families, to mean something in this community. You've turned it into a liability that threatens everything he worked for. Marcus opened another folder, this one containing the transition documents that would formally transfer control. Mr. Ashworth, you have 2 options. Option 1, contest this action in court, where the evidence of business failure and loan default will become public record. probably destroying any remaining value the company might have. Option 2, cooperate with the transition, maintain your dignity, and potentially remain with the company in a reduced capacity under new management. Harrison looked around the lobby desperately, as if searching for support that wasn't coming. His eyes landed on Miss Patterson, who'd been watching this corporate execution with the expression of someone who'd seen it coming for months. "Helen," he said to his secretary, "call my lawyer, this is insane. They can't do this." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat delicately. "Miss Ashworth, your lawyer is David Miller from Miller and Associates. He reviewed the original loan documents 18 months ago and advised you to be very careful about the performance requirements. You said they were just formalities that would never be enforced." The color drained from Harrison's face as he realized that even his own legal counsel had warned him about the trap he was walking into. David reviewed these documents. He specifically highlighted sections 8.1 through 1 through 1.3 and recommended modifications to the performance benchmark. "You told him that Victoria would never enforce those clauses because we were family." I almost felt sorry for him in that moment. Almost. But then I remembered 18 months of condescending dismissals, of watching him drive Grandpa's company into the ground while refusing help from the one person in the family who actually understood how to fix it. "The transition will be effective tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I announced, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "All current employees will be retained during the evaluation period. All existing contracts and obligations will be honored. All safety violations will be immediately addressed. David Chen will serve as interim operations coordinator until new management systems are implemented." David Chen, my truck driver, your former head driver. Yeah, unlike his previous management, I actually listen when experienced employees identify problems and propose solutions. "David has been running your dispatch operations informally for months because your official systems don't work." Harrison slumped into one of the lobby chairs, the fight draining out of him as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his stubborn denial. "This is really happening, isn't it? It started happening the day you told me that trucking was too complicated for someone who worked with computers and charts," I said, gathering my documents and preparing to leave. "Tomorrow, you'll get to see exactly what computers and charts can accomplish when they're used by someone who understands both technology and transportation." Marcus handed Harrison a copy of the transition document. "You have 24 hours to review these materials and prepare for the management handover. I'd recommend using that time constructively." As we walked toward the door, I turned back to face the man who'd inherited everything and managed to lose it through sheer incompetence and pride. "Uncle Harrison, Grandpa built this company to last. Tomorrow, we're going to make sure it does." The glass doors closed behind us with a sound like finality itself. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus shook my hand with professional satisfaction. "That went even better than we planned," he said. Harrison's completely unprepared for what's coming next. I looked back at the building that would be mine by morning, watching Harrison through the window as he sat in stunned defeat, finally understanding that the family member he'd dismissed as irrelevant had been planning his professional obsolescence for 18 months. "No," I corrected, starting toward my car. "Harrison's completely unprepared for what's already here." I arrived at Ashworth Logistics at 7:30 a.m. the next morning, 30 minutes before the official transition, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The building looked different in the early morning light, not like a failing family business teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, but like an operation with untapped potential waiting for competent leadership. Harrison's Buick was already in the parking lot, which meant he'd probably been here since dawn, pacing around his office and trying to figure out how to salvage some shred of authority from the wreckage of his management tenure. Through the windows I could see him moving around inside like a caged animal, probably rehearsing speeches about family loyalty and respect for tradition that would carry exactly zero weight in our new professional relationship. At exactly 8 a.m., I walked through the front doors as the new owner and operator of Ashworth Logistics. Miss Patterson was at her desk, looking simultaneously relieved and nervous, the expression of someone who'd been watching a slow-motion disaster and was finally seeing the possibility of rescue. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. I'd like to schedule an all-hands meeting for 10:00 a.m. in the main warehouse. Please notify all drivers, dispatchers, and administrative staff. Also, I'll need Harrison's office cleared and ready for occupancy by 9:00. Should I tell Mr. Harrison about the office? I'll handle that conversation personally. But thank you. Harrison emerged from his former domain before I could knock, his face a mixture of defiance and defeat that suggested he'd spent the night alternating between rage and despair. He'd clearly prepared for this moment, straightening his shoulders and trying to project the kind of authority he no longer possessed. Victoria, we need to talk about this arrangement. I'm willing to work with you, but I won't be humiliated in front of my employee. I've been running this company for 12 years. Into the ground, I replied calmly, setting my briefcase on what was now my desk. But yes, we do need to establish the parameters of your continued employment. Please, sit down. The power dynamic in the room shifted with those two words. Harrison hesitated, clearly wanting to remain standing to maintain some illusion of equality, but the legal reality was that he was now an employee speaking to his boss. After a moment of internal struggle, he lowered himself into the chair across from the desk he'd occupied yesterday morning. First, I began, opening a folder labeled Personnel Transition. Let's be clear about the new organizational structure. I am the Chief Executive Officer and majority owner of this company. All operational decisions, financial commitments, and strategic planning now require my approval. Your role, should you choose to remain, will be Regional Operations Coordinator, reporting directly to me. Regional Operations Coordinator, that's a fancy title for middle management. It's a title that acknowledges your knowledge of local routes and customer relationships, while recognizing that your management style nearly destroyed everything Grandpa built. I slid a document across the desk. This is your new job description, compensation structure, and performance expectations. Unlike our previous family arrangement, your continued employment will depend entirely on measurable results. Harrison picked up the papers with trembling hands, his face cycling through emotions as he read the terms that would govern his professional survival. You're cutting my salary by 40%. I'm paying you what your performance justifies. The previous salary was based on ownership equity that you forfeited through loan default. This salary is based on the value you can provide as a mid-level operations employee. Victoria, I'm your uncle. We're family. I leaned back in my chair, studying the man who'd spent 18 months dismissing my expertise while driving our family's legacy into bankruptcy. Uncle Harrison, yesterday you told me that family doesn't need lawyers to settle family business. Today you're sitting in my office as an employee who defaulted on a loan I guaranteed with my house. Which version of family are we talking about? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of every condescending comment, every dismissed suggestion, every moment he'd treated my professional competence as irrelevant to real business. Harrison's jaw worked as he struggled with the reality that the power dynamic had been completely inverted. What are the performance expectations? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Measurable improvements in driver retention, customer satisfaction, and operational efficiency. You'll work directly with David Chen to implement the modernization protocols you've been resisting for 18 months. GPS tracking, digital dispatch, customer communication systems, all the computer and chart work you said was too complicated for trucking. And if I refuse, then you'll be unemployed by lunch, and your severance package will consist of whatever personal items you can carry to your car. I opened another folder. But I hope you'll choose to stay, Uncle Harris. This company needs people who understand the local market and have relationships with long-term clients. It just doesn't need people who think tradition is more important than survival. Harrison stared at the employment contract like it might bite him. You really think you can turn this place around, just like that? I don't think anything, Uncle Harrison. I know exactly what needs to be done because I've spent 18 months studying this industry while you've been pretending that GPS systems and customer portals are optional luxury. I stood up, ready to begin the real work of transformation. The question is whether you're willing to be part of the solution, or if your pride is more important than your paycheck. He signed the contract without another word, his signature shaky but definitive. As he handed the papers back to me, I saw something I'd never seen in Harrison's eyes before: respect, not the condescending affection of an uncle for his naive niece, but the genuine respect of an employee for a boss who clearly knew what she was doing. The all-hands meeting is in 45 minutes, I said, gathering my materials for the presentation that would introduce the new era of Ashworth logistics. I'd recommend using that time to prepare mentally for significant changes. And Uncle Harrison, welcome to the team. After he left, I took a moment to absorb the significance of sitting behind the desk that had belonged to my grandfather, then my uncle, and now me. The office still smelled like Harrison's cologne and stale coffee, but that would change. Everything would change, starting with the meeting that would determine whether Ashworth Logistics had a workforce ready to embrace the future, or a collection of people stuck in the past. At 9:45 a.m., I walked into the main warehouse carrying a presentation folder and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've earned your authority through preparation, competence, and the assembled employees, drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, and administrative staff looked at me with curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases hope. David Chen stood near the front, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Behind him I could see the faces of people who'd been watching their company slowly collapse while management ignored their suggestions and dismissed their concerns. These were the people who'd been keeping Ashworth Logistics functioning despite leadership failures, and they deserved to know that their loyalty was about to be rewarded with actual competence. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the warehouse. "My name is Victoria Ashworth, and as of this morning, I am the owner and CEO of this company. Some of you know me as Harrison's niece. Today you're going to know me as the person responsible for turning this operation into the kind of company you can be proud to work for." The room was absolutely silent, every person focused on the woman who'd just claimed ownership of their professional lives. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether they'd trust the new leadership or resist changes that threatened their comfortable dysfunction. For the past 18 months, you've watched this company lose contracts, lose drivers, and lose respect in the logistics community. You've made suggestions that were ignored, identified problems that were dismissed, and watched opportunities slip away because management was too stubborn to modernize. I paused, making eye contact with as many people as possible. That ends today. The presentation I delivered that morning wasn't just a company meeting, it was a declaration of war against mediocrity, inefficiency, and the kind of stubborn traditionalism that had nearly killed everything my grandfather had built. For 45 minutes, I laid out a comprehensive transformation plan that addressed every complaint, every frustration, every ignored suggestion that the workforce had been carrying for years. Within 60 days, I announced, clicking to a slide showing the new fleet management system, every truck will be equipped with GPS tracking, real-time communication capabilities, and route optimization software. No more guessing about delivery times, no more lost shipments, no more apologizing to customers for problems we should have prevented. Maria Santos, one of our veteran dispatchers, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Ashworth, I've been asking for digital tracking for 3 years. Mr. Harrison always said it was too expensive and too complicated." "Maria, you'll be leading the dispatcher training program for the new systems. Your experience with manual coordination will be invaluable in designing workflows that actually make sense for our operation." I saw her straighten with pride as she realized her expertise was finally being recognized. "In fact, I want each of you to understand that the suggestions you've been making about safety protocols, route efficiency, customer service improvement, those aren't complaints anymore. They're your job assignments." The energy in the room shifted palpably. These were people who'd been watching their company fail while knowing exactly how to fix it, and suddenly someone in authority was not only listening, but putting them in charge of implementing solutions. David Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd finally found a leader who understood competence. "Ms. Ashworth, what about the driver retention issues? We've lost some really good people because the benefits package hasn't been competitive." Effective immediately, we're implementing a comprehensive benefits overhaul designed by Montenegro Transportation Solutions, our new strategic partner. Health insurance premiums reduced by 40%, retirement contributions increased, performance bonuses tied to safety records and customer satisfaction scores. Plus, every driver will receive professional development training that will make you more valuable in the industry. whether you stay with us or move on to other opportunities." The last part drew surprised murmur. Most companies fought to prevent employees from gaining skills that might make them attractive to competitors. But I'd learned from watching Harrison's failures that loyalty built on fear and limited options wasn't loyalty at all. It was desperation that bred resentment and poor performance. Now I continued, clicking to the next slide. Let's talk about customer acquisition and retention. We've lost some major accounts over the past year, but we're going to win them back by becoming the kind of company they wish they'd never left. I spent the next 20 minutes detailing the customer service protocols we'd implement: real-time tracking portals, proactive communication systems, damage prevention program, and the kind of professional responsiveness that had made Montenegro Transportation Solutions the fastest-growing logistics company on the West Coast. When the formal presentation ended, the questions came rapid-fire. Not skeptical challenges, but the eager inquiries of people who'd finally found someone who spoke their professional language. How quickly could the new systems be implemented? What kind of training would be provided? Would there be opportunities for advancement based on performance rather than seniority? Each question reinforced what I'd suspected during 18 months of watching Harrison's failures. This company was full of competent people who'd been held back by incompetent leadership. They hadn't been failing, they'd been failed. The real validation came 2 hours later when my phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, the procurement director at Brookfield Manufacturing, the account Harrison had lost 6 months earlier due to missed deliveries and poor communication. "Ms. Ashworth, this is Jennifer Walsh from Brookfield Manufacturing. I heard through industry contacts that there's been a management change at Ashworth Logistics. I wanted to reach out because frankly we were disappointed to end our relationship with your company. The service quality declined significantly over the past 2 years. Jennifer, I appreciate the call. Yes, there's been a complete operational restructure. I'm now the CEO, and we've implemented comprehensive improvements to address exactly the issues that caused problems with our service delivery." "What kind of improvement?" I spent 15 minutes detailing the modernization program, the new tracking systems, the enhanced customer communication protocols, and the performance standards that would prevent the problems that had cost us their business. Jennifer's questions grew more interested as I described capabilities that most logistics companies still considered cutting edge. "This sounds like exactly what we needed from Ashworth 18 months ago," she said finally. "Would you be interested in presenting a proposal for resuming our partnership? We've been through 3 different logistics providers since ending our contract with you, and none of them have provided the combination of local knowledge and professional systems we need." "I'd be very interested, Jennifer. Can we schedule a presentation for next week? Actually, could you come in tomorrow afternoon? We've got a shipping crisis that our current provider can't handle, and if your new systems are as comprehensive as you describe, we might be able to work out an emergency contract while we discuss long-term partnership." After hanging up, I called Rachel Montenegro in Seattle to share the news. Her reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Victoria, that's incredible. Brookfield Manufacturing is exactly the kind of account that validates everything we're building. If we can win them back within a week of taking over, it sends a message to the entire regional market that Ashworth Logistics is back in business." "It gets better, Rachel." Jennifer mentioned that they've been through 3 providers since leaving. "That suggests there's a service gap in the market that we can exploit if we execute properly. I'm flying out tonight with our best customer acquisition specialist. We're going to make that presentation so compelling that Brookfield won't just renew their contract, they'll expand it." The afternoon brought 2 more calls from former clients who'd heard about the management change and wanted to explore resuming their relationships with Ashworth Logistics. Word traveled fast in the logistics industry, especially when a company known for stagnation suddenly started talking about modernization and professional service standards. But the most satisfying moment came at 4:30 p.m., when Harrison appeared in my office doorway, his expression a mixture of amazement and grudging respect. "Victoria, I just got off the phone with Tom Morrison from Morrison Freight. He wants to schedule a meeting about reinstating our contract. He said he heard we'd finally entered the 21st century. That's excellent news, Uncle Harrison. What did you tell him?" "I told him he'd need to speak directly with you, because all strategic decisions go through the CEO now." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally. I also told him that the new management actually knows what it's doing. I appreciate that, Harris, and I want you to know that your local relationships and route knowledge will be valuable assets as we rebuild these partnerships. The difference is that now we'll have the operational capacity to deliver on the promises we made. As Harrison left my office, I realized that the transformation wasn't just happening in systems and procedures, it was happening in people. The same employees who'd been demoralized by months of watching preventable failures were energized by the possibility of working for a company they could be proud of. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door at 5 p.m. with a stack of employment applications. Ashworth, we've had 12 drivers inquire about positions since word got out about the benefits improvements and new equipment. 3 of them used to work here and left for better opportunities. That's excellent, Mrs. Patterson. Please schedule interviews for early next week, and make sure David Chen is involved in the process. His input on driver qualifications will be invaluable. As I prepared to leave that first day as CEO, I looked around the office that had belonged to my grandfather, then my uncle, and now me. The space still needed redecorating to reflect the new era, but it already felt different. It felt like the headquarters of a company that was going somewhere instead of a museum preserving the memory of past success. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Just landed in Hartford, ready to show these East Coast logistics companies what real customer service looks like. Tomorrow's presentation is going to be legendary. Tomorrow would be the real test, proving to Brookfield Manufacturing that the changes at Ashworth Logistics weren't just promises, but operational realities. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, I felt like the company my grandfather had built was finally in the hands of someone who understood that tradition without innovation was just another word for failure. 3 weeks into the transformation, Ashworth Logistics had become unrecognizable from the failing operation I'd inherited. The changes rippled through every aspect of the business like stones thrown into still water, creating effects that reached far beyond profit margins and customer contracts. This wasn't just about saving a company anymore. It was about demonstrating what happened when you replaced toxic leadership with competent management. The most dramatic change was in employee morale. David Chen had been promoted to operations manager with a salary increase that reflected his actual value to the company rather than Harrison's arbitrary compensation structure. Maria Santos was now director of dispatch operations, leading a team that had implemented the digital tracking system with efficiency that surprised even our technology vendors. Ashworth, Maria reported during our weekly leadership meeting. Driver productivity is up 23% since implementing the GPS routing system. But more importantly, we've had 0 missed delivery windows in the past 2 weeks. 0. I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've never seen numbers like this. The transformation wasn't limited to metrics and systems. The physical workspace itself reflected the new culture of professionalism and respect. The break room that had been furnished with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that worked intermittently now featured comfortable seating, a proper kitchen setup, and a bulletin board where employees posted suggestions that were actually reviewed and implemented. But the change that meant the most to me was happening in the broader Willowbrook community. Ashworth Logistics had employed 47 people at its peak under my grandfather's leadership. When I took over, we were down to 28 demoralized employees watching their company circle the drain. Now, just 3 weeks later, we were back up to 38 employees and actively recruiting for 6 additional positions. Each new job created ripple effects throughout the local economy. Tommy Rodriguez, a driver we'd hired away from a competing company, was able to move his family back to Willowbrook from 2 towns over because our benefits package made the commute unnecessary. Sarah Kim, our new customer service coordinator, had been working 2 part-time jobs to support her elderly mother. Now she had 1 full-time position with health insurance and enough stability to plan for the future. The impact extended beyond our immediate work. Local mechanics were seeing increased business as we upgraded our fleet maintenance to professional standards. The truck stop on Route 9 was reporting higher traffic as our drivers had better reasons to recommend Willowbrook as a rest point to colleagues from other companies. Even the diner across from our headquarters was busier during lunch hours as our expanded staff had money to spend and reason to celebrate small victories. Rachel Montenegro's integration with our operations had exceeded every expectation. Her team's expertise in customer acquisition had helped us win back not just Brookfield Manufacturing, but 3 additional accounts that had been considering switching to our competitor. The emergency contract with Brookfield had turned into an expanded partnership that included handling their time-sensitive pharmaceutical deliveries, the kind of high-value work that required exactly the reliability and communication systems we'd implemented. Victoria, Rachel said during our Thursday strategy call, we need to talk about expansion. I'm getting inquiries from companies in Massachusetts and Vermont who've heard about what we're doing here. The reputation for reliability and professional service is spreading faster than we anticipate. What kind of expansion are you thinking? Regional hub development. We established satellite operations in Springfield and Burlington staffed with management trained in our protocols but rooted in their local market. It's the kind of growth that creates sustainable competitive advantage while maintaining the customer relationships that make this business personal. The expansion discussion represented something I'd never imagined when I walked into Harrison's office 3 weeks ago. Ashworth Logistics wasn't just surviving the transition. It was positioned to become a regional leader in an industry that rewarded competence and punished complacency. But the most profound change was happening within families throughout Willowbrook. Marcus Thompson, one of our veteran drivers, had been struggling to keep up with his mortgage payments under the old compensation structure. The raise and benefits improvements we'd implemented meant his wife could reduce her hours at the nursing home to help care for her aging father. Their teenage daughter, who'd been considering dropping out of high school to work, was now making plans for community college. Ms. Ashworth, Marcus had told me the previous Friday, I want you to know that what you've done here, it's not just about the job. It's about families having hope again. My daughter asked me yesterday if I was proud of where I worked. I hadn't been able to say yes to that question in 2 years. The transformation was attracting attention beyond our immediate industry. The Willowbrook Gazette had run a feature story about the company's turnaround, focusing on how modern management techniques and employee respect had revitalized a traditional family business. The article had generated calls from business students at the regional university who wanted to study our transition as a case example of successful organizational change. More importantly, other small businesses in the area were beginning to adopt some of our practice. Peterson's Auto Repair had implemented a customer communication system similar to our tracking portal after seeing how effectively it worked for managing complex logistics. The Willowbrook Garden Center had restructured their employee benefits package based on conversations with our HR consultant, resulting in their first year without seasonal worker turnover in recent memory. Even the town government was taking note. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, the same Patricia from the bank who'd supported our loan transition, had called to discuss Ashworth Logistics, serving as a model for other struggling businesses in the area. Willowbrook had been losing young families for years as employment opportunities dried up and local businesses failed to compete with larger regional companies. Victoria, Mayor Hendricks had said during our meeting the previous Tuesday, what you've accomplished at Ashworth isn't just good business, it's community development. When a local company demonstrates that professional management and employee respect can compete with corporate giants, it gives other business owners permission to believe they can do the same. The mayor's comment had resonated deeply because it captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. The transformation of Ashworth Logistics was proof that competence and character could triumph over entitlement and tradition. Every successful delivery, every retained employee, every satisfied customer was evidence that merit-based leadership worked better than authority based solely on inheritance or gender assumptions. The most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. Harrison himself had requested a private meeting to discuss his role in the company's expansion plan. The man who'd dismissed my expertise as irrelevant to real business was now asking to be included in strategic planning sessions, where those same computer systems and analytical charts were driving unprecedented growth. Victoria, he'd said, clearly struggling with words that challenged everything he'd believed about leadership and family hierarchy, I owe you an apology, not just for the office situation with Delilah, but for 18 months of refusing to see what you were trying to tell me. You weren't trying to undermine my authority, you were trying to save the company I was destroying. The apology mattered, but what mattered more was the recognition that systemic change required more than just replacing bad leadership with good leadership. It required creating an environment where competence was rewarded, where employee suggestions were valued, where customer needs drove operational decisions, and where success was measured by sustainable growth rather than short-term profit preservation. As I reviewed our 3-week performance reports that Thursday evening, the numbers told a story that went beyond business metrics. We'd created 47 jobs that supported 47 families in a community that had been watching opportunity disappear. We'd demonstrated that local businesses could compete professionally with regional corporations. We'd shown that treating employees with respect and customers with competence wasn't just morally right, it was strategically superior. The transformation of Ashworth Logistics had become something larger than corporate turnaround. It had become proof that when you put qualified people in positions of authority and give them the resources to succeed, they don't just meet expectations, they exceed them in ways that benefit everyone involved. The call from Garrett came on a Friday evening, just as I was reviewing the quarterly projections that showed Ashworth Logistics on track to exceed pre-decline revenue numbers by 15%. His voice carried that familiar mixture of desperation and entitlement that had once made me feel guilty for having boundaries, but now just sounded like the whining of someone who'd finally run out of other people to blame for his problems. "Victoria, we need to talk. Delilah's been crying for 3 days. And Ezra keeps asking why Aunt Victoria doesn't live with us anymore. You can't just abandon your family because of some business disagreement." I set down my pen and leaned back in my executive chair, looking out at the Ashworth Logistics parking lot where our drivers were finishing their evening check-ins with the kind of professional efficiency that would have been impossible under Harrison's chaotic management style. "Garrett, I didn't abandon anyone. I was evicted from my own home office, so your wife could have a playroom for your child. There's a difference. That's not fair, Victoria. Delilah was just trying to make space for Ezra. She didn't mean to disrespect your work. She told me that anyone could do my job from anywhere because it was just talking on the phone all day." She unplugged my router in the middle of a client presentation to make room for a juice box warmer. "Which part of that suggests respect for my work?" The silence on Garrett's end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its defensive edge. She might have said some things she didn't mean, but Victoria, you're being extreme. Moving out of your own house over a misunderstanding. I didn't move out, Garrett. I was forced out. And it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a demonstration of how little you and your wife value my contributions to this family. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky the same orange color as the Ashworth Logistics logo that now represented success instead of failure. "But you're right that we need to talk, all 3 of us, tomorrow at 2:00 p.m. at the house. It's time to establish some permanent arrangements." The meeting I'd called for Saturday afternoon wasn't just about the house or the office or even the fundamental disrespect that had triggered my departure. It was about accountability, forcing people who'd taken my generosity for granted to confront the consequences of their choices and decide whether they wanted to be part of my life going forward or casualties of their own entitlement. I arrived at the Willowbrook house exactly on time, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents they didn't know existed and legal options they'd never considered. The front porch where Mom used to sit with her morning coffee looked different now, not like home but like a property I happened to own and they happened to occupy. Delilah answered the door with Ezra on her hip, her face puffy from what had apparently been days of crying over consequences she'd never seen coming. She'd dressed carefully for this conversation, probably hoping that looking like the perfect suburban mother would somehow make me forget that she'd dismissed my career as unimportant while living in my house and spending my money. "Victoria," she said with forced brightness, "I'm so glad you're here. We've missed you so much, haven't we, Ezra?" She bounced the toddler, who looked at me with the confused expression of a child who didn't understand why the adults around him kept acting strange. "Hello, Delilah. Where's Garrett?" "He's in the living room." "Victoria, before we talk, I want you to know that I'm sorry if I said anything that hurt your feelings. I was just stressed about Ezra's development, and sometimes I don't think before I speak. Sorry if she'd hurt my feelings. Not sorry for dismantling my professional workspace, Not sorry for dismissing my career as trivial. Not sorry for treating my generosity like an entitlement. Sorry if I'd been too sensitive to appreciate her thoughtless cruelty. We'll discuss that with Garrett present, I said, walking past her into what had once been my sanctuary and was now their temporary residence. Garrett sat on the couch looking like a man who'd finally realized that actions had consequences, but still hoped he could negotiate his way out of accountability. The living room showed signs of their extended occupation, toys scattered across the floor, Delilah's yoga equipment in the corner, takeout containers on the coffee table that I'd bought and they'd claimed. Victoria, thank God you're here, Garrett said, standing up with the kind of relief that suggested he'd been dreading this conversation. We can work this out, we're family, we always figure things out. Sit down, Garrett, both of you. I opened my portfolio and placed it on the coffee table between us, the way Marcus Whitfield had done with Harrison's loan documents 3 weeks earlier. We're going to have a conversation about respect, accountability, and the future of our relationship, all of our relationship. Delilah perched on the edge of the couch, still holding Ezra, like a human shield, her eyes fixed on the portfolio with growing alarm. Victoria, what's in those papers? Documentation, Delilah. Something I've learned is very important when dealing with people who don't honor their commitments or respect other people's contributions. I pulled out the first document, the mortgage agreement that showed I was the sole owner of the house they'd been treating like their permanent residence. This is the deed to this property. As you can see, my name is the only one on it. Garrett's face went pale as he recognized the implications. Victoria, you wouldn't. We have nowhere else to go. Ezra needs stability. Ezra needs parents who understand that stability comes from taking responsibility for your own lives, not from assuming other people will indefinitely subsidize your choices. I placed the second document on the table, a formal eviction notice that I'd had Marcus prepare, but hoped I wouldn't need to use. This gives you 60 days to find alternative housing arrangements. 60 days. Delilah's voice cracked with panic. Victoria, that's not enough time. We don't have the money for deposits and moving expenses. You can't just throw us out on the street. I'm not throwing you anywhere, Delilah. I'm ending an arrangement that was supposed to be temporary but became permanent without my consent. The same way you ended my use of my own office without my consent. That's completely different, she protested. We're family. We needed the space for Ezra, and I needed the space for my business. The business that pays the mortgage on this house, that paid for the groceries you've been eating, that covered the utility bills you've been running up. I leaned forward, letting them see the steel in my eyes that I'd learned to use in boardrooms full of men who thought they could intimidate me. But the difference is that my business was actually important, actually generating value, actually supporting this family. Your playroom was just convenient for you. Garrett tried to salvage something from the wreckage of their position. Victoria, maybe we can work out a rental arrangement. We could pay you fair market rate for the space. Fair market rate for a 4-bedroom house in Willowbrook with a converted office space is $2,800 a month, plus utilities. Can you afford that, Garrett? The silence answered my question. Of course they couldn't afford market rate rent. If they could, they wouldn't have needed to move in with me 18 months ago when Garrett lost his job, and Delilah decided that her Instagram lifestyle was more important than his job search. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, placing a third document on the table. You have 2 options. Option 1, you can accept this lease agreement, which gives you the house at $1,500 a month, significantly below market rate, but enough to cover my actual cost. The lease includes specific clauses about respecting the home office space and maintaining the property in good condition. Delilah grabbed the lease agreement, scanning it desperately for loopholes or escape clauses. $1,500 a month. Victoria, we can't afford that either. Garrett's still looking for work. Then you should have thought about that before you decided my workspace was less important than your convenience. I gathered the documents back into my portfolio. Option 2 is the 60-day notice. You find somewhere else to live, and I reclaim my home and my office space. What about Ezra? Delilah's voice had shifted from panic to manipulation, the tone of someone who'd learned to use her child as leverage in adult conflicts. He's just a baby. He doesn't understand why his family is being torn apart. Ezra's family isn't being torn apart. Delilah. His parents are being held accountable for their choices and their disrespect. There's a difference. I stood up, ready to leave them with the consequences of 18 months, of taking my generosity for granted. You have 48 hours to decide which option you prefer. After that, I'll proceed with whatever legal remedies are necessary to protect my interests. As I reached the door, Garrett called after me with the desperation of someone who'd finally realized that his sister's patience wasn't infinite. Victoria, what do you want from us? What would it take to fix this? I turned back to face the brother who'd stood silently while his wife dismantled my professional life, and the woman who'd dismissed my career as trivial while living in my house and spending my money. I want acknowledgement, Garrett. I want both of you to understand that what happened wasn't a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental lack of respect for my work, my space, and my contributions to this family. Okay, he said quickly, we acknowledge that. We're sorry. Can we move forward now? No, Garrett, sorry isn't enough. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally bump into someone. What Delilah did was deliberate, calculated disrespect, and what you did was enable it by staying silent. I opened the door, ready to leave them with the reality of consequences they'd never considered. Acknowledgement means understanding that respect isn't optional in relationships, and that people who can't provide it shouldn't expect to receive the benefits of relationships they've damaged. I walked out of the house I owned, leaving behind the family members who'd learned that Victoria Ashworth's generosity came with expectations of basic human decency, and that violating those expectations had prices they couldn't afford to pay. 2 months later, the changes in everyone's lives had settled into a new equilibrium that none of us could have imagined during those tense confrontations in my living room. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and now we were all living with the consequences of choices made and boundaries enforced. Garrett had found employment as a project coordinator at Morrison Engineering, one of the companies that had resumed their logistics contract with us after hearing about our operational improvement. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that his job came partly through connections made during Ashworth Logistics' business development effort. He was earning $68,000 a year, not the executive salary he'd enjoyed at Brookfield Financial, but enough to support his family with dignity and independence. More importantly, Garrett was working with purpose for the first time in 2 years. The job required him to coordinate shipments, manage timelines, and communicate with logistics providers, skills that gave him genuine appreciation for the complexity of operations he'd previously dismissed as simple trucking. When he called me now, it was to ask professional questions about transportation efficiency rather than to make excuses for his wife's behavior. Victoria, he'd said during our weekly check-in call the previous Tuesday, I owe you an apology that's about 18 months overdue. I stood by and let Delilah disrespect your work because I didn't understand what you were actually doing. Now that I'm coordinating logistics projects myself, I realize how incredibly complex and important your expertise really is. The acknowledgement mattered because it came from understanding rather than desperation. Garrett wasn't apologizing to manipulate me into resuming financial support. He was apologizing because he'd gained enough professional competence to recognize competence in others. Delilah's transformation had been more dramatic and more resistant. The reality of paying $1,500 a month in rent while managing household expenses on Garrett's income had forced her to confront mathematics that her Instagram lifestyle had previously ignored. She'd taken a part-time position at the Willowbrook Community Center teaching children's yoga classes, bringing in enough money to cover groceries and utilities while gaining something she'd never had before. Income that came from her own efforts rather than other people's generosity. The work had changed her in ways beyond financial contribution. Teaching required patience, planning, and genuine care for other people's children, qualities that translated into more thoughtful parenting with Ezra. She'd stopped treating him like a prop for social media posts, and started engaging with him as a developing person who needed guidance rather than just entertainment. Victoria, she'd said during a tentative coffee meeting the previous week, I want you to know that I understand now why my comments about your work were so hurtful. Teaching these classes has shown me how much preparation and skill goes into making something look easy. When parents thank me for helping their children develop confidence and coordination, I realize that's the same feeling you must get when your business recommendations help companies succeed. The comparison between children's yoga and supply chain optimization wasn't perfect, but the sentiment behind it was genuine. Delilah had finally developed enough professional identity to respect other people's professional achievement. She'd also learned to live within her means, rather than assuming that family members would indefinitely subsidize her lifestyle choices. The most surprising transformation had been in Ezra himself. The toddler who'd once screamed constantly in an environment of adult tension and financial stress was now a cheerful, curious child who played independently and interacted positively with other children at the community center. The stability that came from parents who worked purposefully and contributed meaningfully had given him the security that money alone couldn't provide. But the change that gave me the most satisfaction was happening within the extended family dynamics around Harrison and the business. Uncle Harrison had not only accepted his reduced role but had begun to thrive within the structure of competent management and clear expectation. His local knowledge and customer relationships were valuable assets when properly directed, and he'd developed genuine respect for the systems and processes that were driving our success. Victoria, Harrison had told me during our monthly performance review, I spent 12 years trying to run this company the way I thought my father would have wanted. But watching what you've accomplished in 4 months, I realized that Dad would have wanted me to adapt and grow, not just preserve traditions that weren't working anymore. The admission represented a fundamental shift in how Harrison understood both business and family legacy. Instead of viewing change as betrayal of the past, he'd learned to see innovation as honoring the entrepreneurial spirit that had built the company in the first place. Our working relationship had evolved into something more collaborative and respectful than either of us had expected. Harrison brought insights about local market conditions and long-term customer relationships that complemented the operational efficiency and strategic planning I provided. David Chen had become our bridge between traditional knowledge and modern systems, translating Harrison's experiential wisdom into actionable data that improved our decision-making. The business itself had exceeded every projection we'd made during those early planning sessions with Rachel Montenegro. Our employee count had grown to 52 people, including the satellite operations we'd established in Springfield and Burlington. Revenue was up 43% year-over-year, but more importantly, our reputation for reliability and professional service was attracting customers who paid premium rates for quality logistics support. Rachel had relocated her East Coast operations to Willowbrook, transforming our partnership into a full merger that created Montenegro Ashworth Transportation Solutions. The combined company was positioned to compete for regional contracts that neither operation could have handled alone, and we were already in discussions with potential customers in New York and Pennsylvania. Victoria, Rachel had said during our quarterly strategy meeting, we've created something that goes beyond what either of us could have built separately. The combination of your operational precision and my growth strategy, plus Harrison's local knowledge and David's practical expertise. It's the kind of management team that makes other companies nervous. The success was validating, but what mattered more was the impact on the community and the people whose lives had been improved by competent leadership and respectful management. Families throughout Willowbrook were more stable because their breadwinners had reliable employment with companies that valued their contributions. Other local businesses were adopting our practices and seeing similar improvements in efficiency and employee satisfaction. The personal relationships within my family had also found a sustainable balance. Garrett and Delilah were building financial independence and professional competence, while maintaining family connections based on mutual respect rather than one-sided dependence. Ezra was growing up in an environment where adults worked purposefully and treated each other with consideration. Sunday dinners at the Willowbrook house had resumed, but with a completely different dynamic. Instead of gatherings where I provided everything and everyone else consumed, these were collaborative meals where people contributed according to their abilities and participated as equal. Garrett brought groceries. Delilah prepared dishes she'd learned to make within budget constraints. Harrison shared stories about customers and community history, and I provided the space and the satisfaction of watching our family function like adults who respected each other. The transformation extended beyond our immediate family to the broader network of relationships that had been damaged by years of enabling and entitlement. Harrison's relationship with other local business owners had improved as Ashworth Logistics became a reliable partner rather than a cautionary tale. Garrett's professional reputation was rebuilding as he demonstrated competence and reliability in his new position. Delilah was developing friendships with other parents at the community center based on shared interests rather than shared complaints about their circumstances. Most importantly, the changes had proven sustainable because they were based on genuine growth rather than temporary compliance. Everyone involved had developed new skills, new perspectives, and new levels of self-respect that made regression unlikely. We'd all learned that respect wasn't something you demanded based on family relationships or inherited positions. It was something you earned through competence, consideration, and contribution. The Victoria who had sat in that library conference room 4 months earlier, humiliated and displaced from her own office, felt like a different person. Not because my fundamental character had changed, but because I'd finally learned to apply the same standards of professionalism and accountability to family relationships that I'd always used in business context. The lesson had been simple but transformative. People rise to meet the expectations you set for them, but only if you're willing to enforce consequences when they fall short. Family love didn't require accepting disrespect, and generosity didn't require enabling irresponsibility. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is the opportunity to discover their own competence through meeting appropriate challenges. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the Willowbrook Community Center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of local business owners, recent graduates, and community leaders who'd gathered for the first annual Women in Business Leadership Conference. The same building where Delilah now taught children's yoga classes had become the venue for discussing how competence-based leadership could transform not just individual companies, but entire communities. The invitation to speak had come from Mayor Patricia Hendricks, who'd watched the ripple effects of Ashworth Logistics' transformation spread throughout the local business ecosystem. "Victoria," she'd said when she called 6 weeks earlier, "what you've accomplished isn't just a business success story. It's proof that when qualified people are given authority and resources, they don't just meet expectations, they redefine what's possible." As I prepared to address the audience, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that humiliating morning in my commandeered home office to this moment of community recognition. The transformation hadn't just been about saving a failing trucking company or establishing boundaries with entitled family members. It had been about proving that merit-based leadership worked better than authority based on tradition, inheritance, or assumptions about who belonged in positions of power. 12 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. I was told that my work was unimportant enough to be displaced by a toddler's playroom. Today, the business strategies I develop from that same home office, now permanently and respectfully mine, generate revenue that supports 58 families in this community and beyond. The applause was immediate and sustained, but what mattered more was the recognition in the faces of women who'd experienced their own versions of professional dismissal and family disrespect. I could see teachers who'd been told their expertise was less valuable than athletic programs, nurses whose medical knowledge was questioned by male administrators, accountants whose financial recommendations were ignored until male colleagues repeated them verbatim. The lesson I want to share isn't about business turnarounds or family conflicts, I continued, looking directly at the young women in the audience who were just beginning their professional journeys. It's about understanding that respect isn't something you request politely and hope to receive. Respect is something you command through competence, enforce through boundaries, and maintain through consistent demonstration of your value. I told them about the 18 months of watching Harrison destroy our family's legacy while dismissing my offers of help. About the morning Delilah dismantled my professional workspace while calling my career trivial. About the decision to stop enabling dysfunction and start enforcing accountability. But I also told them about David Chen's promotion from overlooked driver to operations manager. About Maria Santos leading technology implementation that industry experts had said was too ambitious. About Harrison's evolution from resistant patriarch to collaborative team member. The most important thing I learned, I said, clicking to a slide that showed Montenegro Ashworth Transportation Solutions' current organizational chart, is that competent leadership creates opportunities for everyone to succeed. When you put qualified people in positions of authority and give them resources to implement their expertise, the benefits extend far beyond individual achievement. The business metrics were impressive: revenue growth of 67% year-over-year, employee retention rates of 93%, customer satisfaction scores that placed us in the top 5% of regional logistics providers. But the numbers that mattered more were the community impact statistics: 43 families who'd achieved financial stability through quality employment, 12 local businesses that had adopted our management practices and seen similar improvement, 6 women who'd been promoted to leadership positions in companies that had previously overlooked their potential. Success isn't just about what you accomplish personally, I told the audience, thinking about Rachel Montenegro's decision to relocate her entire East Coast operation to Willowbrook, creating 26 additional jobs and bringing West Coast business practices to our traditional New England community. Success is about creating systems that allow other people to discover and develop their own competence. During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand with the kind of tentative confidence that reminded me of myself 18 months earlier. "Miss Ashworth, what do you do when family members don't support your professional ambition? How do you handle people who think your success threatens their authority?" "You stop asking for their permission," I replied, remembering the moment I'd realized that Harrison's approval wasn't necessary for my competence to be "You stop trying to prove your worth to people who benefit from keeping you small, and you start building relationships with people who recognize talent and want to help it flourish." I told her about Rachel's immediate enthusiasm for partnership, about Marcus Whitfield's meticulous legal preparation, about the bank's support for competent management over family tradition. Surround yourself with people who want you to succeed, and you'll discover that the people who tried to hold you back were never as powerful as you thought they were. After the formal presentation, I was approached by Sarah Kim, our customer service coordinator who'd been promoted to regional account manager after demonstrating exceptional skill at client relations. "Ashworth, I wanted to thank you for creating the kind of workplace where women can advance based on performance rather than politics. My daughter sees me going to work excited about my projects instead of dreading another day of being ignored and undervalued." The comment captured something essential about the transformation we'd achieved. We hadn't just saved a failing business or established better family boundaries. We'd created an environment where competence was rewarded regardless of gender, where experience was valued regardless of formal education, where innovation was welcomed regardless of how things had always been done. As I drove home that evening, I passed the Ashworth Logistics headquarters, where the lights were still on in our dispatch center, where drivers were completing their end-of-day check-ins using systems that made their jobs easier and more efficient. The building that had once symbolized decline and dysfunction now represented growth, opportunity, and the kind of professional excellence that made other companies want to partner with us rather than compete against us. The Willowbrook house was quiet when I arrived, the home office glowing softly behind windows that had once framed my humiliation, but now showcased my triumph. The space was exactly as I'd designed it: professional, efficient, and respectfully off-limits to anyone who didn't understand that serious work required serious environment. My laptop chimed with an email from Jennifer Walsh at Brookfield Manufacturing, confirming our largest contract to date, a 3-year partnership that would require us to expand our fleet and hire additional drivers. The same company that had canceled their relationship with us under Harrison's mismanagement was now betting their supply chain operations on our competence and reliability. But the message that brought me the most satisfaction was a text from Garrett. "Victoria, just wanted you to know that Ezra's daycare teacher said he's one of the most confident and well-adjusted children in his class. She thinks it's because he has such strong role models at home. Thank you for showing us what that looks like." The transformation was complete, sustainable, and expanding beyond what any of us had imagined possible. We'd learned that respect wasn't inherited or demanded, it was earned through competence and maintained through consistent excellence. We'd discovered that family loyalty didn't require accepting disrespect, that generosity didn't mean enabling dysfunction, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give people is the opportunity to meet appropriate expectations. Most importantly, we'd proven that when you put qualified people in positions of authority and give them resources to succeed, they don't just meet expectations, they exceed them in ways that benefit everyone involved. The ripple effects of competent leadership extend far beyond individual achievement, creating opportunities for families, communities, and industries to flourish. My name is Victoria Ashworth. I'm the CEO of Montenegro Ashworth Transportation Solutions, the owner of the home where I live and work on my own terms, and living proof that competence combined with courage can transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. And to anyone out there who's been told their work doesn't matter, their expertise isn't valued, or their ambitions aren't realistic, they're wrong. Your competence is real, your contributions are valuable, and your success is not only possible but inevitable once you stop asking for permission to be excellent. The only question is, are you ready to claim the authority you've already earned? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.